All right, everybody, I am back with a brand new DC update, and today's update is a doozy. The Hollywood Reporter just released an article where they interviewed Zack Snyder, and it is a lengthy article. I was going to read the whole thing, but it would take about a half an hour, and I didn't want you guys to have to sit through a half an hour video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen here, and I will also leave a link to this article in the description so you can go read it in its entirety. But this goes through the whole history of Zack Snyder from his early filmmaking career up to where he's at now doing his whole sci-fi epic and creating a world around Rebel Moon. But what's interesting about this article is it has sparked a lot of talk online this morning, and it's getting crazy, that he is basically done with DC and that there's only one project he will ever do for them again, and that it is not Justice League 2 and 3. And we're going to talk about this. We're going to look at this article. I'm going to read the stuff that pertains to the DC materials, and then I'm going to talk about what this means at the end, because I don't think it means what people are saying it means online. And you have to read between the lines here, okay? Because, let's just take a look at this. So I'm going to share this article. The Hollywood Reporter, Zack Snyder's next cut, no capes allowed. After the chaos and controversy of his DC movies, the polarizing director is giving outer space a try with Netflix's Rebel Moon. All right, so at the beginning here, it talks about how he has this crazy obsession with Fortnite. His wife would catch him at 3 o'clock in the morning, not sleeping in their bed, but working, playing Fortnite on his console. And she basically brought him in some clay and tools and says, you need to make something. And now he's got this hobby of doing pottery in his house. They talk about his house, how it resembles 2016's Batman versus Superman's Dawn of Justice. Bruce Wayne's house. His house kind of resembles that. He's got a gym. He's got his pottery studio. He's got his preview studio for movies and stuff all right there. And it talks about his early time with, they go on to talk about Rebel Moon 2, and they talk about how it's a grittier version of Star Wars. And what you find out in this article is that his Star Wars Rebel Moon version was pitched to Lucasfilm prior to Disney picking it up. But once it was picked up by Disney, he knew that he would never, ever get his movie made there because he demanded that it be rated R. And this article goes and talks about many times on how he requires that his movies be rated R. And it's kind of interesting. So when he was filming Rebel Moon is when he found out that Peter Safran and James Gunn had taken over for DC. He actually called up James Gunn and told him that he was happy for him and he wanted it to work. So he actually called up and talked to him. So James Gunn has said he's never talked to Zack Snyder, and that isn't true. He actually did call him up that day and congratulate him. So again, we catch James Gunn lying about stuff. It's interesting. There's a quote here, and this is stuff where it goes on to talk about some of the DC stuff. He said, Snyder is not the sort of filmmaker who's feted at film festivals, or even the sort whose movies sparkle at the box office on the 4th of July weekend. His operatic, bombastic pictures are blunt instruments, not precision, clockwork devices, which is part of what makes them so contentious. But boy, do they have their fans. An army of them who have at times weaponized social media in his defense in ways that have been known to cow even hardened studio executives. Specifically the ones at Warner Brothers who in 2020, 3 years after Justice League tanked at the box office, capitulated to fan demand and gave Snyder $80 million to reshape his own director's cut. I never looked at it as the job. Oh, I'm the architect of DC. I need to create entertainment for DC that sells toys, that is for the masses and fun for everyone. He says of his Warner Brothers years, I didn't care about that. I liked Batman. I liked Superman. I wanted to make something cool. You picked the wrong guy if you wanted a product. And the guy Netflix picked to make a sci-fi epic fantasy and what to expect. Judging from a visit on the set, he's molding a whole new world, one conspicuously lacking Kryptonian orphans or billionaires brooding under cowls. That's when it goes on to talk about his journey on making Rebel Moon and how everything has to be R-rated. That's when he talks about also the Lucasfilm stuff. And so there's going to be 2 versions of Rebel Moon, one that's PG-13 in theaters and then a rated R version that comes out later. This goes on to talk about how Snyder worked with Gunn when they were both starting out in their film careers. Gunn wrote Dawn of the Dead, but the two ended up following very different paths. In fact, Gunn, who helmed the Guardians of the Galaxy movies for Marvel, became pretty much an anti-Snyder, while Snyder went on to explore the dark, tortured coils of Clark Kent's sunny soul. Gunn shot poppy, soundtrack-laden, feel-good sci-fi flicks that made outer space look like a blast. I called him, and I said I wish all the best for him. Snyder would later say about Gunn moving into his Fortress of Solitude. I told him I wanted it to work. It goes back to what I said a few minutes ago. Then it goes into his early career here, where he shot commercials and other things, and how he had to quit the movie SWAT because he wanted to be rated R and they wanted PG-13, so he quit, and he cautioned future filmmakers to, it's not advisable to quit their early, their first jobs. All right, so let's go in. They talk about him making $300 and how that made him a household name. So let's move into with the DC stuff. At the time, of course, Nolan was coming off of directing a trilogy of wildly successful Batman movies, the Dark Knight films, and was now tasked by Warner's with relaunching another DC comic book hero, the one in the blue tights and red cape. It wasn't the first time Snyder had been approached with a Superman project. Like a slew of other hot Hollywood directors, he'd previously been considered by Warner Brothers in its perennial quest for a reboot. But Nolan's more grounded take on the character clearly appealed to Snyder. He signed on to direct Man of Steel, beginning his decade-long odyssey through the DC universe. And it wasn't a decade for him. So, sure, some fans were jolted by Man of Steel's off-putting climax when Superman snaps Zod's neck, committing murder for the first time in the cinematic universe's history. He wasn't committing murder. He was saving a bunch of people. I don't like how these people, categorize this stuff when that's not murder. It was self-defense. But no matter, Warner seemed all in on Snyder's darker version for the franchise, positioning its DC movies as the antithesis of the softer superhero rivals at Disney-owned Marvel. After the $200 million film grossed $670 million worldwide, Snyder's stock at Warner Brothers was up, and away. He was going to make more movies and oversee spin-offs. There would be tales of life and death, of God, of man and gods. It was modern mythology, and Snyder saw himself as a Hollywood Prometheus. Alas, the gods had other plans. Only about half of Snyder's grand ambitions came to pass. Wonder Woman, produced by Snyder and his wife and directed by Patty Jenkins, grossed $821 million worldwide and was a pop culture phenomenon. Aquaman, directed by James Wan, grossed $1 billion, but Snyder's own movies didn't go quite as planned. Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice ended up costing so much, $250 million. Its $874 million grosses were considered a disappointment. Just as painful for Snyder, the film was savaged by reviewers. Well, and that's because they cut out a half an hour out of the movie, which destroyed the movie. He said, "That's when I was at my most vulnerable." And then there was Justice League, which was supposed to be a zenith of Snyder's directorial career, but ended up being the nadir. At some point during post-production on the ambitious superhero ensemble, Warner's began to lose faith in Snyder's instinct, pushing him to pivot toward a more marvelous tone and approach. And this happened long before that, because they messed up Batman vs. Superman, which they had a knee-jerk reaction to. And then they completely changed the Suicide Squad because of the same thing. So it happened long before he started doing Justice League. And it said, Snyder pushed back, fighting to keep his darker version. But then at the height of the battle, Snyder's 20-year-old daughter, Autumn, took her own life. Unsurprisingly, Snyder and his wife lost their will to fight and stepped back from the movie to focus on their family, which is what they should have done. The studio brought in Joss Whedon, who had directed Marvel's first $2 billion grossing Avengers film to finish cutting Justice League. "We cared deeply about what we were doing," Snyder says of back and forth over the Justice League cut. "We weren't trying to make an Avengers movie. We weren't. We didn't know how, quite frankly. They brought someone in that did. I've never seen the Whedon version, but it wasn't the answer." I'm going to call it Justice League. Justice League was released in November 2017, making $661.3 million worldwide. On paper, not a bad number, but again, relative to its $300 million budget, a disaster. It took a toll, says Deborah of their time with DC and Warner's. It was amazing to come up with a new Superman and to bring Wonder Woman to the big screen for the first time. There were so many amazing moments. Then at the end, there were so many heartbreaking moments. In 2019, on her first day on the job as chairwoman and CEO of Warner Brothers, Ann Sarnoff entered her office to find dozens of bouquets and fruit baskets. Her heart melted at what she assumed was the generosity of Hollywood, welcoming the seasoned TV executive to the role of overseeing all Warner's divisions. Then she opened the first card and it said, "Welcome to Warner Brothers. Now release the Snyder Cut." She opened the second card. It had a similar message, one after another, recounts Snyder, who says Sarnoff told him this story. She didn't even know what it was. She wasn't even aware of the saga. When she told me the story, she was like, "This is the job, managing this? I didn't know it was a thing." Now it was the thing. At first, the Snyder Cut was assumed to be just a rumor. Nobody knew for sure if he possessed an unfinished version of Justice League, one that was said to be far better than what was released. Nevertheless, the hashtag "Release the Snyder Cut" began popping up online, eventually congealing into something like an organized movement. They put up a billboard in Times Square. They hired a plane with a banner to fly over the Warner's lot, timed so that executives would see it at lunch. The myth, of course, turned out to be real. Snyder did indeed have a cut, which he made clear when he teased images of film canisters on social media, sending his legions of fans into a frenzy. More confirmation came from friends like Aquaman's Momoa, who publicly insisted they had seen snippets. At times, the fan revolt went decidedly overboard. Some studio execs, like Walter Hamada and Jeff Johns, were viciously intimidated. Well, that's not necessarily true. They brought a lot of this on themselves, okay? We already heard about how they treated some of these actors on the set of Justice League, and it's just crazy that they're trying to make these people out to be innocent when they're not. Security was upped at the lot, but the Snyder Army also had a heart. After the death of Snyder's daughter, they launched a campaign to boost awareness and funds for the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention, raising more than $1 million. I'm not going to comment on the details of whether they are good or bad, whether they are toxic or bullying, says Snyder. That's in every chat room. It's what comes with the internet. But I do know that the work they did on some level was good. I can say for a fact that they did good. That is undeniable. There's been some question about how real Snyder's army actually was. A report in Rolling Stone claimed that the sizable chunk of the online Snyder Cut traffic was generated by bots, which is not true, and we're seeing that by the faltering of these movies at the theater. The Snyder fans are a much bigger group than what they're making them out to be. The truth is, it doesn't matter. The movie got made, Snyder responds. If they were smart enough to employ bots in this thing, then they won. That movie has no business existing, and it does. Bots or not, the Snyder Army pressured the studio to fork over $80 million so that Snyder could release his cut of the film. Of course, it didn't hurt his case that Warner's was then launching HBO Max and sorely needed buzzy content to pull in subscribers. Indeed, the studio's desperation may have encouraged Snyder to go even further when he was empowered to reshooting major scenes and adding new storylines and material. He was trying to reclaim Justice League, scoffs one executive at that time. Well, and he should. It was his movie. He should reclaim it. And the fact that they just caved to fans is not the case. The only reason the studio did this is they saw money because it would bring in subscribers for HBO Max. So again, they're being disingenuous with the reporting here, but let's continue. Back on his compound overlooking Pasadena, Snyder is preparing for the launch of a brand new sort of Snyderverse. Only this time, he notes, he'll control its IP. After Rebel Moon premieres in December, the second part will arrive on Netflix in April. In between, there will be a graphic novel, a podcast, and a photo book. Then, fingers crossed, a third film. As for the superhero universe he's left behind, he doesn't sound nostalgic. We've been on the treadmill. It has not evolved. I don't have the excitement for it that I used to have, he says, of the genre before giving tour of his new pottery studio, where row upon row of his creations, mugs and bowls mostly, plus some bunnies for his 12-year-old daughter, line the shelves. He says he has a secret plan to make 100 mugs and then sell them at the Rose Bowl flea market. He's not joking. He's kept in touch with some of his old pals from the DC world. He occasionally talks to Ezra Miller, lending support to the actor as he casts the Flash throughout their recent mental health and legal challenges. They did a great job with the Flash movie, Snyder says. It's very difficult to play against yourself. He's also in touch with Ray Fisher, the unknown he hired to play Cyborg in Justice League, who later accused Whedon of racism on the set. Fisher, who has a part in Rebel Moon as an insurgent leader, says of his director, he's weathered the storm in a way not many people could or get to do. And he's been dismayed to see Amber Heard suffer online amid controversy over her divorce from Johnny Depp. I just don't get it. If other people don't like her, I don't know what to say. I would work with her in a second. But Snyder says that chapter of his life is now closed, and it would be difficult to coax him to reopen it. If his buddy Gunn called and invited him back to DC, he might consider doing a Dark Knight Returns adaptation, but only a true representation of the graphic novel. If Marvel rang, he might think for a beat about Daredevil and an Elektra movie, maybe adapting Frank Miller's Elektra Lives Again. But that's it, he insists. What about Star Wars? Nah, I don't think so, he says. Those guys have a handle on the brand. For now, he says he's entirely focused on the new universe he's molding on a distant remote moon, where nobody wears spandex and flies without a spaceship. And he's busy expanding his own real-world Snyderverse that is his family. He became a grandfather last year. In the end, he says of his chaotic DC years, it could not have gone any other way. Notice that this paragraph here is the one that everyone's talking about, that he would only come back to do a Dark Knight Returns adaptation for DC. He says if his buddy Gunn called and invited him back to DC, he might consider doing a Dark Knight Returns adaptation. Under Gunn. He is not saying he is done. He still wants to tell his Justice League 2 and 3. And I want to talk about this. And notice that this stuff is not in quotes, okay? The only time it's in quotes is at the end when he talks about Star Wars. It's actually here in parentheses where it says, nah, I don't think so, he says. Those guys have a handle on their brand. Okay, let's talk about this here. Does this article say he is completely done with DC? Absolutely not. In fact, he even says in this article he would come back for Gunn if he was given the opportunity to do a true adaptation of The Dark Knight. What he didn't say is that he's done telling his Justice League movies. There's still 2 movies that he would like to do. He was just at this event. We talked about this before, just 6 months ago or so, where he talked about if they gave him the chance to come back and finish Justice League 2 and 3, he would do it in a heartbeat. And so would the actors. Okay, they all were there during this event, and they all said they would come back. Well, they didn't all say they would come back, but they were very enthusiastic. They even got Ben Affleck in there to come in for this event. They all have this loyalty towards Zack Snyder, and they would come back if he was able to finish his story. People are falsely saying that he's done, he's moving on. He is definitely not moving on. What he's doing right now is he's got this whole universe he's creating with Rebel Moon, which is going to be wildly successful. I'm telling you right now, it is going to be wildly successful. I guarantee it. What he's not doing is completely walking away from the DC stuff. If he's given the chance, he will finish the story because he specifically said under Gunn. There are people who don't want to work for Gunn. There are people who are walking away. They don't want to have anything to do with Warner Brothers at this stage because of their business practices. And so their talent pool is much smaller. So under Gunn, he would come back and do The Dark Knight Returns. But what happens in the future if this gets sold? I could tell you that this article talks about how he was tight with Nolan at the beginning of all of this. If everything gets sold over to Universal, which people are assuming is going to happen, it's not just me and some other YouTubers are talking about this. This is the industry's talking about this, that there are things going on behind the scenes where they honestly believe that Universal is going to be purchasing Warner Brothers and possibly the whole DC brand here sometime late, mid to late next year. If that happens, game over. Game over. If Nolan gets in charge of this stuff again, and their team over there at Universal and all those people who work there, and they are willing to bring the Snyderverse back, I guarantee you Snyder would come back in a heartbeat and finish those 2 movies. This is not the end. We can't look at it as the end. He didn't say it's the end. There were no quotes with him saying it's the end. He's saying currently, right now, under James Gunn, he would only come back to do a true adaptation of The Dark Knight Returns. So there is still hope for the future, guys. I think this is actually more positive than negative. And I think it's a good indication that he has not shut that door and he would like to continue on. All right, so what are you guys' thoughts on this article and the buzz that's going around the internet? I should be back later today with another DC update because there's some things I want to talk about in regards to Aquaman and Lost Kingdom and some of the reports that are out there. So I will have a formal update, but I wanted to get this one up in regards to this article in the Hollywood Reporter because it's a big one. It's a doozy. All right, so what are your guys' thoughts? I appreciate the support. If you haven't already, like the video, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and you will be notified as I have new videos go up.